You are listening to When Therapists Watch TV, where we discuss today's buzzworthy TV shows and what they can teach us about ourselves, our relationships, and the world around us. I'm your host, Dr. Terry Bly, licensed clinical psychologist at LA Mental Health. When I first started watching Ted Lasso, I thought I understood, who each of these characters were going to be throughout the show. Like you had Rebecca, who is, that hard exterior. She's like the boss bitch villain person, and then there's Ted Lasso, who's like the doofy, like, I'm happy and everybody loves me and I love everybody all the time. And, Jamie is that arrogant superstar that people love, but he's a jerk to everyone. I just thought that I got it, right? And I was a little disappointed, to be honest, because I thought, really, this is the show everyone's talking about, and they're all just caricatures. And then I started to see that exterior peel away, and that's when I fell in love with the show. As I started to see, we've got a lot more in these characters that we're going to learn about. And so as we were learning about these characters and their backgrounds and their histories with their families and their marriages and stuff, I started to think, what we're seeing are what happens to people, how we create these exteriors, how we create these personas that we don't just use out in public, but even in our relationships, and that to some extent, some of this stuff that we create comes out of trauma. And one thing that we know about trauma is that, when bad things happen to us, whether it's the big T traumas, as we call them in therapy, big T traumas are like, major accidents or death of somebody, or little T traumas like being bullied or, going through like chronic kind of low level, maybe poverty, which is a trauma, but it's not that sort of dramatic thing we usually think about. Anyway, when we look at how those affect people, the way it affects them is how we come to think of ourselves. And that's when we're doing trauma work as therapists, that's what we're getting at, is when these things happen to you, what belief did you come to have about yourself? And so today, what I'm going to talk about has to do with trauma. And to do that, I brought in Gina Young. She is a licensed independent clinical social worker, also known as an LICSW. And she does a lot of work here at LE with those of us who are trying to learn more about doing trauma interventions. She heads up what's called a case consultation group, where she helps all the rest of us talk through cases, clients that we have who've been through trauma, and how can we help them. And so she's going to be here. She's here with me today to talk about what we can learn from these characters when it comes to how our personalities, how we show up in the world, can be shaped, at least in part, by the negative experiences that happen to us and what these characters show us in terms of examples of that. So, welcome.
Hi, Terry.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited.
Me too. You know how excited I am.
Yes, and I know we've been messaging back and forth with ideas and getting all excited about this. So I'm so glad we're finally here.
Me too.
So I know that you have a lot of notes and thoughts.
I do.
So I thought, if it's not too much putting you on the spot, that maybe you could tell me what character, or maybe first, like, how did you see this show? You're the one who said to me, like, we got to do one on trauma. So tell me about where that came from. Why did we need to do a show here about Ted Lasso?
And trauma. I have been working in the community and with outpatient clients for the last 8 to 10 years with a focus on trauma, and that's with kiddos and adults. And I've seen it across the age span and across settings. And the more work I do, the more I come to understand that almost everybody has some sort of trauma that they're carrying with them.
Yeah.
And I was excited to see a show that unfolded in a realistic way and showed us that, sort of like you talked about, those masks and what we show people on the outside when we first meet them, it's just the first part of the story. And through getting to know them and through these real relationships with the backdrop of sports, right? And in another country, we get to realize and see their connections and see them open up to one another and start to share those pieces of themselves that we don't always show everyone else. I think it enriches the show, and it makes me so interested in the characters. And I want to see them grow over time. And the same with clients, right? I want to see that growth over time. And so to see that on a big show like this, also with, you know, sort of soccer and football being the center stage as well, I just loved the idea of being able to explore that. And once you look for it, you can see it throughout the show and throughout most of the characters too. So
I also like how they come out of this with compassion and some humor. Yes. It is considered a comedy.
Yes.
And so I find this to be such a good show that to illustrate trauma and its impact on us, but in a way that is both relatable and not so in your face that you want to like rock in a corner.
Exactly.
Like
or cover your eyes.
Like there are some shows that clearly address trauma, but in a way that's almost traumatic to watch.
To the watcher. Yeah, absolutely. To the viewer. 100%.
And so I feel like people who've been through trauma, who've been through hard stuff, can watch this show without worrying that it's necessarily, I mean, everyone has their stuff, but that I think that it just comes at this with such a gentle and compassionate way, but also clearly gets at, like, hey, these people have been affected by stuff, and let's look at what that has done to them.
And the other piece too is that it's not all about their trauma.
No, it's exactly.
It's
in fact,
not
it's not
them
about
overcoming
their trauma.
That's not it, actually. It's just about them being people out in the world that they interact with. I actually really like that. Because that's, I think, you know, our clients, the people we see are out in the world just doing their thing. And so I really like that relatable aspect of the show as well.
And I think some people certainly go to therapy because some big T trauma has happened to them. But I think a lot of people go to therapy because they're unhappy, they don't feel good about themselves. And it isn't until they're in therapy that their therapist starts to talk to them about, I mean, people, you know, we kind of joke about, well, no, I'm gonna ask you about your mother because I'm a therapist. But when people start to understand how those early interactions or even later relationships affected their beliefs about themselves, and that when those are negative and the beliefs you develop about yourselves aren't working for you, what we call in therapy adaptive, when they're not adaptive, that's a traumatic response. That's you know, that's when we start to let those beliefs kind of take shape and you know, become weeds in the garden, I think is how it was explained to me. And that can really negatively affect our lives. And so what I'm hoping we can do today is take a look at some of these characters and maybe explore this, because again, this, as I was telling you earlier, this is newish to me, this idea of how traumatic events, negative early experiences, negative later experiences can really inform our our personalities. It's kind of mind-blowing to me. And so so I was hoping maybe we could look at some of the characters here, and I'm going to put you on the spot and let you pick the character you think.
Tough choice. Okay, well, I think
we'll have time to talk about
all of it. Okay, great, good.
Yeah.
I think Rebecca is the best one to lean on. We've talked a lot about her. Yes, and she's so layered. And you know, like we just said too, I think we can all relate in some way to Rebecca and being a woman and experiencing what she's experienced. So I think her story is one that really also shows such humanity and growth over the 2 seasons that I also really connected to.
Well, I think that's what makes her character so wonderful to observe. Is you start out, again, the first episode, you think, oh, she's just going to be
we don't like her,
this vengeful, bitter person, and we're not going to like her, and there's going to be nothing. It's just going to be about like defeating her. But man, once you start to see, like, she got to me, like, just to see why she was, and how not just why she was the way she was, but like how people almost required that of her, like her ex-husband and the press, and how being vulnerable clearly was not going to serve her. But so let's dig into Rebecca. Tell me, if we were going to connect this to trauma, I can see us discussing her marriage to Rupert.
Absolutely.
And then, you know, we learned some about her parents, her mom, her dad, their messy relationship, and what you learned about that. So what are your thoughts when it comes to Rebecca and how, you know, early family experiences, so for some reason I'm losing my words. I'm like, but those early experiences with parents, first of all, like maybe just observing like your parents' relationship or feeling like you're not being heard there. But then also these later, like I have a lot of clients who are going through divorce or contemplating divorce, who've been through divorce, that are trying to figure out what happened to me.
Yeah, and who am I now?
Not the same person.
Right.
I don't like who I am now. So
Right.
maybe we can talk about early experiences with Rebecca, and then also your thoughts on.
Absolutely. I think while I've been listening to you a little bit, I also wonder about her attachment style. That's always also my first thought when I'm.
Which is also formed
Absolutely.
in part by trauma.
Hugely. And so I'm thinking very like avoidant for her. With a mom who was around but not really, and a dad who wasn't really around and who just bought things for everybody to show their love. And how you also see that in her character, that vulnerability is absolutely not okay. And that's true for, I think, several characters in this show, that we actually come to find that through vulnerability, they're better able to connect with people, they're able to heal, and they're able to become their best selves when they open up to others in a way that feels safe to them. So I think that's one piece of her character arc that I appreciate the most.
Well, she says as much.
Yeah, absolutely.
She says, when they're joking, like she and Ted are talking about why they don't need to do therapy.
Yeah.
She says as much.
Yes, she does.
I push people away, and
I already know.
I already know what my issues are. Like I just push people away, and then I end up like facing
my favorite kind of client is when they already know
the thing that I'm trying to avoid, which is being alone.
Yeah.
So tell me about, what do we know about, if you have parents who aren't bad parents,
Right.
but maybe they're preoccupied with their own stuff. Mom, obviously, mom was what we learned about mom, and after we meet mom on the show, like she's very wrapped up in her own world and her own growth and her own whatever that is.
Yeah.
And then her relationship with her husband was very messy, off and on kind of thing. And then we know that dad was
in and out. It sounds like
kind of
not available emotionally to either of them, it seems like.
So in your experience, how can that affect how we
adults?
Yeah, as adults, who we develop into, like how we view ourselves, how we think of ourselves.
I think our parents often, or caregivers, are our first archetypes for relationships later on in life. And so if they're not around, if they're preoccupied with themselves, they're focused on money and material items as, signs and forms of love, we almost unconsciously seek that out as an adults. And later on we go, how did that happen? Well, it starts with your parents, right? And so if you also have parents who are just about themselves and never really reflecting your feelings back for you, it's very hard to understand your own emotional states. And why would you talk about feelings?
Yeah.
They're not needed here. That's just not a part of growing up. And I think that is a huge absence in someone's life.
Which I don't think we talk about enough.
No.
I started to talk about it more with my clients, but I only recently really started to explore a parent's role as one of the main jobs a parent has, and I wish we told more parents this, is to help their kids understand their emotions.
Yes.
And to allow those emotions to be in the space. I hear a lot from clients about, they'll say, well, if I went to my parents and I was upset about something, I would hear, whining won't get you anywhere. Or I'll hear, well, think about these other people who have it worse than you.
Yes.
Basically suck it up. You're fine.
Right.
Could always be worse. Or like nobody wants to hear you whine. And then what we believe growing up is that like my feelings don't matter, right? Like isn't that kind of what it becomes?
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
Like, why would I express my feelings? They don't matter, and they might even be bad.
Yes, and I shouldn't talk about them. There's no room for them. Looks like my parents don't have them either, or can't connect with me with them, so we shove them away.
Or they'll love me less.
Yes,
If
exactly.
I express my negative feelings, or if I complain about anything, then they're gonna reject me.
Yes.
And so that then translates right to other. So is that kind of when we talk about avoidant attachment? Is that
That's what
part
we're talking
of that?
about.
We're talking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rebecca carries that. She also seeks out a man who's very focused on himself, right? And what he wants, and having all the things that he wants, and yet they're not able to emotionally connect either. And we carry on this pattern, like I said, unconsciously, without even really realizing it, because that's what we saw when we were kids. And so I think Rupert very much fills that character for her, or fills that role for her of focusing on building this team, and everything was about the team, and everything was about all the money that he had too, rather than the emotional connection that they needed to have between the the two of them. So, yeah.
So the beliefs she might have created about herself was that I have to be tough. I can't express vulnerable emotions.
Yeah.
I just need to show up, and I need to be beautiful, and I need to be strong, and I need to not need anyone.
Yes, and that people aren't going to be there for me.
That people aren't going to be, nobody's going to have my back.
Yeah,
So
I'm on my own.
I'm on my own.
Very much so.
So then as we talk about divorce or being in an abusive marriage, I mean, it's pretty clear he was, he is probably one of the better portrayals of textbook narcissism.
Yes. Agree. Agree.
So exaggerated that it's not even hard to diagnose. It's just, they just went and looked up like, what is a narcissist, and then created Rupert.
Yep.
He's probably one of the few characters that doesn't get to have that underneath piece.
But he helps her tell her story.
Yeah.
Which I think is, he's an archtype for sure.
Yeah. And there are people out there who are like that.
Exactly.
Who I call them they're redeemable narcissists and unredeemable narcissists. I feel like he's an unredeemable narcissist.
I agree with that. Yeah.
So when you're in a relationship like that, so now you're in a marriage where you don't get to have opinions, you don't get to have feelings, you're there to serve his needs.
Yep. How
does that affect a person over time in your experience?
Well, I think even thinking about the charity event that she did too, going back to the show, right? I think I could just see her standing there looking stunningly beautiful and just being sort of the arm candy, right? As he was the charming, witty leader, chair of the event, and he got to host, right? And make all the jokes and have all the attention on him. And I'm sure she stood there and talked to everybody, but he was where everybody really pointed their direction. I think you fall into the background, you get unnoticed, and I'm sure not seen for all of the great characteristics that you have, right? Because it's all about Rupert and whatever he has going on right now.
So more of that message of it's not about you.
Yeah, I don't matter.
I don't matter. I need to, if I try to take the lead, if I try to take up space, I'm just going to get shot down.
Yeah, and there's no room for me.
Which is interesting. I think when a lot of people imagine someone like Rebecca, and I think this is what maybe a lot of women can relate to. I know I can relate to this at least, so I'm going to speak for myself. That when someone presents like Rebecca, she's tall, she's got this presence, she's clearly intelligent, she's capable.
She's confident.
And she presents that.
Yes.
That I think people, a lot of times when they're faced with a woman like this, it doesn't occur to them that that's a mask.
Right.
That's not, that they don't just walk through the world feeling statuesque and confident and intelligent and
those women are intimidating.
Capable. Yeah.
Those women are really intimidating, and we don't connect with them. We admire them and talk about them from afar, but we don't reach out, and we don't ask them to go to drinks, and we don't ask them to hang out because we're intimidated by them. And instead, those are probably the women that need to be connected with the most.
Right, and that's the part that just is so like about Rebecca is the whole she comes across as so put together, and it's that very exterior that she's worked so hard to cultivate. That is and probably to show I'm good enough.
Right.
I'm here. Look how intelligent and competent and put together I am.
Right.
Love me for that. Yeah. And then to have that very thing be what makes people go, oh yeah, you're scary.
Yeah, I can't talk to you.
I think that's what really, and we're going to do another episode just on the women of Ted Lasso, so we can talk about her a bit more in this, but I think that's where we really underestimate how those early experiences of, not having someone help us understand our feelings, and not, whether it's, not making a lot of friends at school when you're younger, or when it's just having parents who don't have time to help you understand and accept yourself, that we can get into that place of that being our exterior. So, so I was thinking, if we moved from that, I want to move to Jamie.
Okay.
Because I think he's in some ways, they're not unrelated in that.
They're both bullies.
They're both bullies. They both have this exterior of
I got this.
attractive. I've got it. I'm confident.
You would be lucky to know
competent.
me.
You'd be lucky to know me.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm in charge when I walk in the room. So he's very much like that with
Very
Rebecca.
much, yeah. They're both hard to like in the beginning.
They are both hard.
Very hard to like. And I think that is what also makes them such great characters
Yes.
too. So
And the show allows them to be more than that.
yes.
So with Jamie, now we're talking about somebody whose dad, I mean, clearly abusive, probably alcoholic, demanded. When I was learning about in grad school about what makes somebody a narcissist, I remember my professor saying, the stereotype that may or may not be true is you've got a mom who's super indulgent, who's like, you are the best, everything you do is the most amazing ever, and then you have a dad who is never satisfied. And I think with Nate
Never
we
good
see
enough.
that too. And so
You're right.
so with Jamie, obviously Jamie and Nate take those upbringings and go in very different
directions. Yep.
So tell me about your thoughts about Jamie and how does someone get to be that sort of peacock style of narcissist as an exterior? Again, I would call Jamie a redeemable.
Yes, I agree with you.
As the show
I agree with you.
unfolds.
Yeah.
Where do you see trauma fitting in with that type of personality?
I think the show does a really good job of, like you talked about before, showing the trauma, but not so much the fact that we don't want to watch, right? Like seeing his interaction with his dad and in front of the team was so moving.
Yeah.
For
and
me.
Painful.
And painful and uncomfortable
Oh
for
my
everyone
gosh.
else.
Yeah.
And that's really what it's like, that emotional abuse. I'm going to name that. Dad is emotionally abusive and at times physically abusive to Jamie, even as an adult. So I can only imagine what that was like as a child, which is your needs don't matter. You are only here to perform. And if you're not doing well at soccer,
You're only here to make me look good.
Exactly.
You're
and to
gonna
my
perform,
friends.
yes,
Yes.
so that I look good.
100%.
Yes.
Again, your needs don't matter.
Yeah. You're
You
here
can-
to make.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you can't be soft. And you need to always be winning. And you need to always be scoring.
Yeah. You can't even be an excellent player who is
Passes
an
the
excellent
ball.
team player. You
Yes.
have to be an excellent. You have to just be the star all
Yes.
the time.
And you have to shine for me.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And to see, it's just so interesting too, because Ted swoops in as this alternative option, this alternative warm man who is cheering him on even when he doesn't do well, even when he passes, even when he doesn't score, and is like, I still love you regardless because you are such a great man.
Which Jamie calls mind games.
Exactly. It's so uncomfortable for Jamie. He was like, I
What are
have
these
never.
mind games?
Yes, exactly,
He's doing.
exactly. It's so foreign to him for someone to care for him just because he's, a human and a good human, right? He's never experienced that before. And we don't learn anything about Jamie's mom, but I do think so much, the dad and the son relationship is so powerful. And you can clearly see just wanting to keep dad happy. Even the choices as an adult that he's making to go to Manchester rather than stay with the team.
Right.
He goes and he knows how thrilled his dad will be about that choice, right? And is a top scorer for that team. Even at, Jamie's got to be in his 20s, early 30s, and he's still letting those unconscious pulls to being the perfectionist and being the scorer lead him in making his adult choices, right?
Well, even as he said, his decision to go on the reality TV show Leave Man
Absolutely.
City was to piss off his dad. So his choices are all about
Right.
that relationship with his dad.
100%.
Trying to please him, trying to piss him off, trying
Right.
to please him. So that personality develops with dad as the core of,
The core,
like his whole
absolutely.
identity at its core is how am I going to make my dad feel?
Right, right. And how is this going to, not about him, not about how it's going to make him feel, all about dad, right? And is that going to make him happy or mad? Or is he going to be thrilled about this? What kind of, and we don't even really ever get to see dad be excited for Jamie either. Like, I don't really think there is any of that.
Is he
It's
ever
always, it felt very toxic.
Yeah.
Like even when you were good enough or not good enough, it was always angry. And always not up to par, which I imagine is what his dad also experienced from his dad.
Right.
That generational passing that on without even really realizing it happens all the time.
So when we talk, if we use it in a trauma framework, what kind of trauma is that? Would you categorize that as like is it an attachment trauma? Is it relational trauma? What kind of trauma?
I think attachment is
that?
fair.
Okay.
I think relational is fair. I think dad's a bully.
Dad's a bully.
And
Right,
Jamie
so,
became a bully. And now it's playing out. So definitely disorganized attachment is my thought
Right.
with Jamie.
Which is
It comes about when you fear your attachment figure.
okay.
When instead of going to that person for safety and love, that's the person that also hurts you or scares you or doesn't say good things about you, doesn't allow you to be seen, right? And so I often, whenever I'm watching TV shows, I'm thinking about their attachment because it helps me understand a little bit their trajectory, right? And Jamie very much is the disorganized attachment. So,
and which is so painful as you watch him try
it
to
is.
figure out his relationship with Keely.
Yes.
That it's so. I want to connect, but oh my God, that's
Too scary.
too. I
And
can't
what if I
do
mess it up?
And what if I mess it up? But I can't stop myself because I need connection.
Yeah.
And she is such an. I mean, she's easily the healthiest character on the show. She and
Carrie.
Higgins.
I fully believe you. Yes.
Keely and Higgins.
And when they have
are
their
there
moment
to
too,
model healthy attachment.
Absolutely, and I love that so much. Higgins is like the
Yeah.
beacon of light for
Yes.
what we want for a relationship. I so agree with you. And they both evolve too in the show, right?
Yep.
And in their relationships as well. So
Right. So we've got Jamie, who's got this attachment trauma, who had a bully as a father. And I remember when I was doing my EMDR training. EMDR, by the way, is it's everyone knows it as like the back and forth eye movement trauma therapy. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So explaining it doesn't necessarily help, or spelling it out. But so when I was doing my EMDR training, which is all about trauma, I remember being just blown away by the way they spelled out that being bullied as a kid, is a form of trauma for some reason.
Absolutely.
Like, and even just being excluded from friend groups is a form of trauma. And that was like, I don't know, for some reason I hadn't framed it that way, of how because it shapes so profoundly how you think about yourself.
right.
When you're bullied, when you're excluded, whether it's by friends or by parents or both, figuring out how do I like myself, and how do I like other people and trust other people? Like that just becomes so much more challenging as we're seeing with Jamie. And what I love is they're starting to show us how he can slowly start to tiptoe out into vulnerability, and how ultimately that's what saves him. Is
100%.
is figuring that out.
I get chills thinking about him in the locker room and Roy coming over and giving him a hug.
Yeah.
It's just so healing to have like another man witness his pain and also say, oh my God, that was awful. And I'm here for you with no strings attached, right? You don't have to be anybody other than yourself. I'm going to love you regardless.
Well, and coming from Roy,
That's huge.
who will be the next. I think that's a great segue, because Roy is
I agree.
another one.
Yep.
Who we're going to talk more about. We're going to do a future episode on masculinity in the show. And Roy he is the centerpiece of that conversation around what Ted Lasso shows us about masculinity.
Yep.
But to have it come from Roy, who at first rejected him, like
Couldn't
wholesale.
stand him.
Yep.
Yeah. Couldn't even be at the same table together.
Like wouldn't coach him,
Right.
wouldn't look at him,
Right.
insulted him, played into the bully stuff.
Yeah.
Like he bullied
Absolutely,
Jamie.
he did. Yep.
And then to see, like, what an amazing experience for Jamie to have somebody who used to hate him now start to, as he's on his own path,
Yes.
to
See him as worthy.
to
Yes.
say, oh, actually, I can see you differently now. I can see you as you, and I'm gonna like you more now that I start to see you as yourself.
And we can thank Keely for being able to see Roy.
Keely
Because
is, yes.
Roy would not be able to heal his own stuff if it wasn't for the relationship that he had with Keely as well. And then he brings that into the relationship that he has and he cultivates with Jamie over time too. It's just so lovely.
Since you bring that up, I wasn't planning to go here, but if we're thinking about how do we, we can't think of ourselves, obviously we wouldn't be therapists if we thought you're just doomed.
Right.
That you develop these attachment styles, you develop these personalities, and you're screwed. I'm sorry. Like
I wouldn't be in this field if that
Exactly.
was the case.
We
You're
burn
right.
out real fast
Right.
if we believed that. So, so how do you think our relationships, like with Keely and Roy, even Keely and Jamie,
Yep.
how can our relationships, our connections with others later in life, how do you see those as changing those negative beliefs about ourselves that come from those traumatic experiences? Like, how often do you think that is what starts to shift that narrative.
I think that's often, right, because we are such social creatures.
But we also tend to gravitate towards people who further the trauma, like
Yes.
Rebecca
Yes.
and Rupert. So
Yes.
how do people come by this?
I agree with that too. I think it's about a different perspective, right? And it's also building self-awareness, right? So I do think Rebecca starts to hold up a mirror to her own experience and hold up a mirror to who Rupert is and goes, oh God, I don't want to be Rupert, right?
Right.
I think that's huge.
Right.
I think that's huge in relationships. Your partner is either there to help you grow and be, a cheering teammate for you, or you're like, oh, we've got some things to work on. I don't want to become that. And
because that is the turning point for
absolutely,
Rebecca.
yes, it is. It's very much
how ugly he is and how he is, and realizing she was going down that path.
Exactly.
And that was her like, oh yeah.
Oh, I don't want that for
this.
myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So being a mirror for them, or an alternative.
Yeah, and I think just in our interactions with, which is one of the main reasons I love being a therapist, is because I get different perspectives from people every single time I meet a new client. Is how do we're each a fingerprint, and all of our experience lead us to something different. And that's also so true with trauma, right? The same thing can happen to two people, but if it happens at different times in their development and different times in their identity development, one person can sail along after it happens and is totally fine, whereas the other person is set back and starts to believe these negative beliefs about themselves that develop when we become overwhelmed by something, which is what the definition of trauma is. Right. And you can also see it too when you have resilient people who have parents who are checking in with them and see them and help them have their own feelings, that we can ride this wave out and you're going to be okay after this. And so I just think it's so hugely impactful, and the show does such a lovely job of it. Of talking about the growth that happens between people and in relationship with people. Because if Ted had never come over, this wheel would have never started turning for Rebecca, right? Would have never started turning for Jamie and Roy. And so just that one new person.
Right, because what Ted and Rebecca what Ted and Keely both do is they react to these people differently than anyone has reacted to them before.
Yeah.
Which is, ding ding, this is going to sound... is what therapists do.
Yes.
Wait,
what a great tie-in.
Oh my God, that's what we do.
Yes, we do. Yep.
I seriously just connected the dots. So that is what we do. So you can have people in your lives who look at you and say, wait, I don't see this thing, and I'm going to react to you differently. I know you're trying to push me away, but I'm still here. I have clients all the time who will say things like, you're probably tired of listening to me complain, or, I probably don't even make sense. I probably I'm sorry if I said something that was offensive. And to be able to say to them, I'm fine.
Good.
I follow you. I hear you. That sounds really painful. I don't hear whining. I hear you telling your story. And to see how that starts to shift for people, to have them, show me their, maybe not their best side, and I don't say, yeah, I can't work with you anymore.
Yeah.
But instead to say, wow, can you come back next week?
Yeah, tell me more.
Yeah, tell me more.
Know more.
I want to know more. And that's what Keely does. That's what Ted does, is they stick with it. And even when Higgins forgives Rebecca and comes back and works for her again, it's those people that are saying, I'm not going to reject you like you're expecting me to do.
You're redeemable.
Yep. I'm gonna see you for who you are underneath that mask, which is scary, which is why Rebecca pushes Ted away. Right. It's terrifying. Is that, wait, no, you're supposed to go away now. That's what this,
I showed you the ugly underside.
That's what this does. This is go. And you're coming back, and now I'm uncomfortable, but now I can start to think through that.
Yeah.
So that's...
I mean, I think we see that so much in Rebecca's telling Ted about her whole campaign against him. And she's expecting him to lose it and want to quit the team.
Really my ugliest side.
Like, this is as ugly as I get. Yeah. You're going to run and you're going to leave. And Ted is like, no, I'm here. I forgive you, and you deserve a second chance. Yeah. There's a lot of second chances in here, which I really think is so human and so great. Yeah. But not as common as maybe it should be. Yes, I agree with that as well too. Yeah.
That a lot of us would have told Rebecca to F off and quit and
peace out.
Been like, so
I
you're
my
trying
whole
to
life over here.
You're trying to sabotage my actual life.
Yes.
So this doesn't feel safe, and I'm gonna go. But instead,
and knowing what we know about Ted, he doesn't quit.
Right.
Right. And this is that I'm not going to quit on you. I'm here and I came and I want to give this a go. And so I think that's something that that can hurt Ted, but in this sense is really wonderful.
Yeah.
And rehabilitative for their relationship and for Rebecca too.
So I was going to go to Roy, but I actually want to come to Ted because
Okay.
I think Ted brings us a very different mask. And we talked about him in the first episode, but I want to talk about him in terms of trauma. Ted is he's the catalyst for everyone else's process.
Yep.
But he needed Dr. Sharon to be the catalyst for his, because he brought his own mask. That thing that's a catalyst for others, in part, is his own mask to protect himself.
Yeah.
That being lovable, showing up, saying, no, you'll still love me. Just wait. I'm going to show you how lovable I am until you give in and love me.
Right.
Is both an amazing trait to have and also can be a mask.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like his cutesy stuff with Dr. Sharon at
Yes.
first. Like, boy, he really tried to turn all of that on.
He did. He made it hard.
So what do you think, and he had trauma and he had an amazing dad from his account who then died in a very traumatic way.
Yeah.
So how do you understand that kind of personality? Those people who are always known for being beams of light, which I'm always suspicious of. That they're just always positive. And I think, okay, there's a reason that you decided it was best and safest to show up this way. I would love your take on that.
I think it's really adaptive, right? I mean, we talked a little bit about that word, right? To always be looking on the sunny side of things. I think it also shows up in his marriage and his own, as he goes through that experience too of a wife who just can't be as positive as him, who cannot sweeten the deal and understand that it's always going to be okay.
Say more about adaptive. When you say it's adaptive, what do you mean?
That when things get really hard, I'm sure probably after the death of his dad, it was either you can sink into a hole of despair and that the people I love the most in the world leave, which he does talk about struggling with. He says, people always leave me, right? Instead of that, he pivoted. And this again, right? The same trauma, a different person at a different time in their development in life, right? And his trajectory is just to go the positive way, is that we can smile our way, laugh our way through this. If I have, a witty quip and like a signature slogan that I can always use, right? Then we can get through anything difficult. And whereas someone else is going to lay in bed for days at a time and really feel like they're going to give up on life. It's not always that black and white, right? Yeah. There's definitely shades of gray in there. But I do think Ted gives us this positive outlook. And during a time when this show came out, when we all really needed it, by the way.
Yes.
When we were
sure
all
did, yes.
feeling down in the dumps. We're like, what? Why do I feel good when watching this show? Like, I've got some light back in my life. I remember laughing.
Absolutely.
And that was so needed at that time. And I think that's also why there's so much love for this show, because we all were hurting and we all needed some optimism, right?
Yeah.
But I do think Ted's optimism can be too much. And it can be, listen, we've got to balance the light and the dark. And he keeps his trauma so tucked away for so long. And it's interesting because he's helping everyone else heal while he also has to do his own.
Yeah.
And he doesn't do that until Dr. Sharon, right? And he makes her work for it.
Yeah.
He really does.
He does. Well, because that, he talks about, his dad dying, but there was also that scene, one of my favorite scenes in the whole 2 seasons so far is when he's playing darts with Rupert. Love that so much. And he was talking about how he got bullied, right?
Yep.
And, and his choice, the way he dealt with it. And I wonder if this is because his dad was alive for most of those developmental years. Is I'm guessing his dad helped him through this, or his parents helped him through this, but it was that decision of they don't see me. They're, and I've got to think someone was there when he was a kid, helping him understand. These people just don't see you.
Right.
They underestimate you.
Right.
Don't let them underestimate you.
Yeah.
But it's not about you. Like, you figure out, you be you.
Right.
Their bullying isn't about you. They just don't see you. And so he actually uses it
I know.
to
the
almost as a weapon, but for good.
Yes. And my favorite, it's the quote, I have it written down, be curious,
Yeah.
not judgmental.
Be curious, not judgmental.
Let's just staple that onto my forehead
Yeah.
and move forward with that for the rest. I should get it tattooed probably.
Yep.
It is, I also think that's sort of his slogan is, I want to know more about you and I'm not going to judge you.
I'm not gonna
and that makes people deeply uncomfortable.
Yes.
It makes Jamie uncomfortable. It makes Rebecca
Yeah.
uncomfortable. It makes those people that have learned vulnerability is not okay.
Yeah.
It makes them deeply uncomfortable. And it turns out he also doesn't love it either.
He doesn't love it either.
He's got his own stuff going on.
Yeah,
that
he has a story that he's going to present to you. This is who I am. And when Dr. Sharon stays curious,
she's
she's
wants
like,
to know more.
oh, this is interesting. Wow, because she always says things to him like, this is really interesting that you're, I see what you're doing here. That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he doesn't like that.
He
like,
does
oh,
not
you
like
see,
to be called
wait,
out.
you see behind this, like,
What I've been
nobody
working
else sees
really hard
past
to,
this.
yeah, absolutely.
And what do you mean you see? What do you see? I'm not.
Well, and I also think too, we see his pain through his panic attacks. I think that's the first way we really learn that he's overwhelmed by his trauma is by when he's in large groups or really noisy rooms, and he goes out to the club, and it's an uncontrollable experience that you can't have a positive spin on that, right?
Yeah. Do you ever see panic attacks as a trauma response?
Absolutely,
okay.
yes, and they're common for that, and it's often triggered by something we didn't even realize we were triggered by until we do some more understanding about what the trauma was and what got stuck in our brains, whether it be the lights, the sounds, the experience of overwhelm, the negative belief that we have about ourselves that got triggered. Our brain does that without our permission, which is why it's a panic attack, and we feel like we can't get control again, right? And we have to leave. And panic attacks also isolate us. It's get out of here because you're gonna be overwhelmed and you shouldn't be around other people. Yeah. And so it's just so lovely that Rebecca is there for him, right? And her growing healing that she's doing to be like, I'm gonna show up for this guy who gave me a second chance,
Yep.
And I just love, again, that healing between relationships. And that I can be here for you, I can be vulnerable, I can see your vulnerability, and I'm not gonna throw it back in your face. And I think Rebecca does such a nice job with that, especially with Ted. So
it really shows how, we can have these bad things that happen to us when we're younger or earlier in our lives. And yes, therapy can be really great to help us understand, but really, we all have that ability to help ourselves and other people by just being curious and just showing up and not responding to our own desire to stay, to not be vulnerable, that if we can muscle through that or learn how to overcome our own fear of getting close, of sticking our neck out and be there and have someone else's back in a way that's genuine, can be healing for both people. Because Rebecca, by being there for him, that helps her, and they're helping each other. It's not one person going around and fixing everybody else. What this show really highlights in such a beautiful way is how these people all had their wounds, their traumas, and by showing up for each other, that's the catalyst. That's what heals.
Yeah.
Dr. Sharon is there to facilitate some of it, but really, she wouldn't be as effective if they didn't all have that community, their team, showing up.
I don't think Ted would ever go to Dr. Sharon if he wasn't curious about why all of his players were going to her.
Yeah.
Be like, what's going on? I need to know what they're getting out of this. I
Well,
think
and
that's
everything had to really start falling apart for him. Which
exactly too.
leads a lot of people to therapy is their way of showing up, those masks
It's not working.
don't work, and they know that it's like, it worked for a while, maybe it worked for a very long time,
really
and then
long
you get
time,
to a point where you're like, oh yeah, this is actually just, I'm on my whatever.
Yeah.
Maybe they're on their third divorce,
Yes.
or they got fired from another job, or
yep.
whatever, and they're like, okay, something's not working, and it might be me, and I need to go into those.
I need some new
uncomfortable
tools.
things. Yeah.
Can't just be optimism, Ted.
So, are there any other characters? I'm looking at oh God, Nate. Do we have time to talk about?
Do we have time?
Oof.
I
Then
know.
there's Nate.
There's lots of stuff about Nate. Who this character that you root for
Yeah.
so much in the beginning, and then you slowly start to see how he sees the world, and how, more importantly, how he sees himself. And I'm going to dive right in on Nate here, the way he treats himself when he looks in the mirror was so uncomfortable for me.
Oh my gosh, that's my least favorite.
It
probably my
almost
least
want to
favorite
look away.
moments in the
Yes,
show.
100. The hate that he has for himself, it is so hard to look at and to watch because one, you know, there are people out there who feel that way about themselves, and I am hurting for them, and I am hoping that someday we get to meet, maybe. And two, the evolution that that hate turns into, and how he sees Ted as letting him down. Oh, again, had it not played out a different way, right? And had this not, if another time, right? Or if Nate had met another person, maybe he wouldn't have seen Ted as a villain.
Yeah.
And now it's going to play out in the next season of like, you abandoned me.
Well, and Ted did. I mean, I as I was watching the show through for like the fourth time, I did notice that Ted
He does.
lets Nate down more than any other character on that show. Like,
Especially in the second season.
yeah, in the second season, you start to see it, and it's these very. You can tell that Ted's
it's minute,
they're minute, but man, that when you look at Nate's face, like when Ted tells him, you know, when Nate offers to talk to Jamie,
The big dog, yep.
a big
Send
dog,
a big dog in.
and Ted laughs.
It's heartbreaking.
That feeds right into that.
I'm worthless.
I'm worthless.
Yes, that negative voice that Nate is
I'm not important
hearing.
enough to talk to one of the players.
Yep.
He's going to bring in Roy to do it instead because Roy is the bigger, and Roy keeps getting the attention and the spotlight because he's the real, like he's the man. That's what we're going to talk about in the masculinity show. Is that, you know, Nate doesn't have anyone modeling for him how to come into himself in an acceptable way.
Yeah, and have a healthy male image of himself, right? I think that's huge too. I mean, even one of my favorite episodes is when he's asking to get a reservation at the restaurant for his parents, and he practices with Keely and Rebecca.
Yep.
Because there aren't any guys available to him to do that.
To show him how to be assertive.
Exactly.
So
he goes to the two women who are, you know, on their own journey. Keely's so accepting, so non-judgmental. She just wraps him up and is like, yeah, I'm going to help you out with this. And how later on, he even when he gets the reservation and gets them at the table, he's still so mad at himself, you know? And to also see a dad that just...
Because his dad can't even be impressed with that. His dad's
His
just
dad
never
just
going to give
does
him.
not, even when he's on the front page of the newspaper,
Yep.
can't say one nice word to congratulate him about
Yep.
how the work that he's doing.
Scolds him for having any pride in it. It's
Exactly.
Like,
To stay
humility
humble.
is to just erase yourself. So I know we're at time. So one question I'm going to be asking my guests to wrap up the show today is, I mean, we could talk about this for hours.
Hours, Terry.
And but I want to know what other show is on your radar right now that you love thinking about from that lens of a therapist.
Jenny and Georgia
Oh, I don't know that
on
one.
Netflix. Shrinking on Apple TV. And then, you know, we've also talked about a few, you know, Sex Education on Netflix as well. But Ginny and Georgia's Mom and Daughter.
Okay. I think my daughter told me to watch that one.
It's a great one. Really centers the adolescent experience in a way. Absolutely a little bit of a soap opera, but has some real life issues in it too that I think are really valuable. And it has a lot of conversations about trauma that are really important.
Okay.
So,
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was great. I really feel like we could sit here for like 3 hours.
yes, we
and
could
talk
do
through
every
this.
single episode and have an hour-long breakdown.
And I am hoping you will come back and talk to me about the women of Ted Lasso.
oh, yes,
and
absolutely.
then we can do some more of this.
I can't wait.
All right.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again.